again. Welcome, everyone. I'm Pam Goins, Executive Director for NASCA. It's so good to see so many of our state chief administrators from around the country. Thank you all so much for dialing in today. We are so excited about this afternoon, the opportunity to have a peer-to-peer, chief-to-chief conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion through the lens of emergency management. You know, we talk a lot about human capital and procurement, but not necessarily through the lens of emergency management. And I'm super excited to have Chauncia with us this afternoon to share a little bit with us through her role at ITM and some of the work that they are doing. We're also going to have an opportunity to dig into a micro review with Missouri. You saw that they won an award last week. And so we have an opportunity to do a little deeper dive, do a micro review with the state of Missouri and their professional development transformation. And then we have an award before we round out this afternoon. But before we get started, we love to have a little bit of fun with our state chief administrators. So let's listen to Did I Sign Up for This?
The craziest thing that happened all year. Oh boy. Probably when I had a state senator literally with a microphone pretending to interview a broken escalator in the Capitol complex.
The craziest thing I've seen this year was our Department of Natural Resources has some deer that they taxidermy to help find and prosecute poachers in the off-deer season, and they end up kind of getting shot in the process and they get a little mangled looking, and so they end up in our surplus division. And my understanding is that those deer were seen by someone and perhaps will get used in a Christmas display this year. So that's up there with the craziest things I've seen this year.
The craziest things I've seen this year is that many employees, legislators, and even the governor's identity was used to falsely apply for unemployment.
What was the craziest thing you've seen this year? The craziest thing I have seen this year, some of you may recall that we had tornadoes that came through on March 3rd. And it was storms that rolled through, the tornadoes came through, you wake up the next morning and the sun is shining, it's beautiful, it's bright. But we know, of course, from the TV, everything that's going on, and you heard it, the storms when that was happening as well. But just to be out in the downtown area, because there was one part of our downtown that was hit really hard, and that little area is called Germantown. But to be in that area and see some of the people walking around and just holding on to 2 or 3 items of their possessions, it was like something out of a movie. It was like an Armageddon movie, because they were just walking around holding on to their things and weren't quite sure exactly what to do. It was really sad. What we didn't know at that time was 25 people in Middle Tennessee lost their lives, and we actually had $1.6 billion worth of property damage throughout Middle Tennessee. We also had state properties that were affected. We lost 2 buildings down on 2nd Avenue, one house DHS, the other one DCS. We lost the beginnings of what was going to be our artifact storage facility for our Tennessee State Museum. Thankfully, none of the artifacts were in there. And we also, unfortunately, received a lot of damage at the old Tennessee State Prison site. And that building had, I say that building, but it's a huge complex, and it had been done in the late 1800s. And it was the scene for a lot of movie shoots. So the castle remained intact, but a lot of the cell block area and the chapel and some of that around the complex were destroyed by the tornadoes. But that had to be the craziest thing I've seen this year.
Thank you to our chiefs who have so graciously volunteered to give us a couple of minutes of your time to record these videos. It's not too late. You're probably still going to get an email from Kayla and members of the Envoy team to take just a couple of minutes to record those. Again, we find these very fun and intriguing and interesting. So again, welcome. I'm so excited to have all of you with us this afternoon. This is day 3 of our 8-day Winter Thought Leadership Series. We'll be taking a pause after today and coming back together on December 1st. But we've got a wonderful afternoon planned, just an opportunity for networking, peer-to-peer conversation, collaboration, really unpacking DEI through that lens of emergency management. But before we kick off with Chauncia this afternoon, I do want to say another just huge thank you to all of our winter sponsors who have been with us. Many are on with us here this afternoon. We can't produce these types of events without your generous donations and support of NASCA. So thank you to everyone who have sponsored and been with us and continue to support NASCA along the way. One of those is Bob Hunt with JLL, and he's going to bring our introduction for this afternoon. So Bob, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bob Hunt, and I'm a managing director of the Public Institutions Practice at JLL, and I'm based in the great state of Washington. See Chris Liu on as well, another Washingtonian. JLL is a long-term partner with NASCA, and we want to thank Pam and the entire NASCA team for hosting this virtual event during these hectic times, as this is a great way for everyone to connect and discuss the important topics that we are all currently facing. Diversity, equity, inclusion is a core focus of JLL as an organization and a core performance metric for every senior manager that is accountable to advancing this cause within the organization at all levels. We know you state chief administrators work to embed diversity, equity, inclusion in your activities in an ongoing way, but perhaps you haven't thought about the importance of this in emergency management. This afternoon, you're thrilled to spend time discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion through the lens of emergency management. And today's speaker is Chauncia Willis, who will help us think through 5 ways to operationalize equity in state government operations during the global health pandemic. Chauncia is the co-founder and CEO of the Institution for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management. Ms. Willis is certified as an emergency manager, professional coach, and cultural diversity professional with over 20 years of experience. Her expertise includes disaster management, national security event planning, leadership coaching, immigrant and refugee outreach, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion and training. Chauncia, sounds like you've done a little bit of everything. Regarded as a national expert, Ms. Willis has provided witness testimony to the U.S. House of Representatives on multiple occasions on matters of diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as policy implementation. She is the author of Stretching, The Race Towards Diversity, Equity, Inclusion in America, which was published in December of 2020. December of 2019, I think. We find ourselves not quite to December of 2020. Chauncia Willis hails from St. Petersburg, Florida, and is a graduate of Loyola University, New Orleans, and Georgia State University, and the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Chauncia and thank all of you for being here today. Chauncia, all yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Bob. That was great. Fantastic. Sometimes I wonder myself, who is that lady? How did she do so much and still look like a teenager? Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and dive right into our presentation because as I understand it, there's a lot of curiosity around diversity, equity, and inclusion within this group. And I want to make sure I'm available and able to answer any questions that might come up. So, Pam, did you want me to use my presentation slides or were you going to? Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. So the presentation today will focus on the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion within the field of emergency management. And of course, it also applies to fields outside of emergency management as well, because these concepts are very core to not only how we do business in every system within the United States, but they can be applied to the individual and the collective body as well. So as I'm going through the presentation, if you have any questions, any comments, just drop them in the chat and I'd be happy to address them as soon as I can. Let's get started. Okay, our organization is the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management. And our organization really is a nonprofit organization that was started to increase diverse representation within the field of emergency management and also reduce the negative impacts of disaster on women, people of color, and other underserved, marginalized groups. So our vision really is to improve and enhance resilience globally, as well as in the domestic United States. We believe that diversity plus inclusion will lead to true resilience for everyone. So today is going to be much more engaging than perhaps we've been able to enjoy in previous sessions and in previous presentations. We'd like to hear from you today. So we're going to actually have a point at the end where we have a breakout discussion after I finish setting the stage for operationalized equity. And I think everyone will enjoy that and have an opportunity to contribute. So today we're going to set the stage for operationalizing equity. And as I said, if there are any concerns, questions, or anything you want more clarity on, just go ahead and drop it in the chat box and I'd be happy to address it. Next slide. Operationalizing equity. Why we're here today, why we're talking about this subject. Well, what we want to do is discuss the return on investment. We want to talk about the need to increase individual and community resilience and how we get to that point. Really, it involves being more inclusive and addressing the issues of inequity. And we're also going to specifically address government leadership and how it can become more equitable. Next slide. What is diversity? So diversity is really the wide range of human differences. It covers race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, social class, country of origin, religious, ethical value systems, and political beliefs, and a wealth of other areas as well. One of the topics that I just presented around was the concept of religious bias and how being a Christian in the United States allows you certain freedoms and certain opportunities, whereas there's bias to most other religions. You can see it with posts on Facebook and things like that. So bias is built into a lot of what we do. And to address the existing bias, we have to also address first diversity and the need for diversity and the need for increased representation. Then we get to equity, and equity is about fair, just, and equitable management of all institutions serving the public directly. Okay, so is there equity in our finance system? Is there equity in our education system? Is there equity in emergency management? And sadly, the response is no or not enough. And when we get to inclusion, inclusion is all about involvement and empowerment. Am I free to show up as my true self? Am I going to be respected for my differences? Am I going to be valued for my input? And it also goes into belonging. Do I feel as though I belong within this organization? So that goes into employee retention. So these three basic concepts actually are considered foundational when it comes to understanding the behaviors of bias. Next slide. When we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the outcome that we hope to have when we're presenting, training, and providing workshops, we're hoping that eventually all roads will lead to equity. And equity is about all people having access to programs, to funding, and resources that make their lives and their communities resilient. Okay, so equity is ensuring that everyone not only belongs, but also has equal opportunity and access to key resources and that their needs are being addressed where they are. Next slide. So what is equity and what is equality? And oftentimes the two are interchanged. Equality is giving everyone a shoe. Equity is giving everyone a shoe that fits. So many times within the field of emergency management, and we'll talk about it a little more, as well as many other fields, people are concerned with equality. Well, you know, the concept is I gave everyone the same opportunity and therefore it was, it was equal opportunity and everyone received the same, opportunity and therefore I'm done. I'm clean. And that's not actually true, because equality is not going to get us to the point where we have true equity. And equity assumes that we understand everyone isn't starting in the same place. So some people may not be starting at the same spot in line, the same starting point. And so we need to address that inequity. And if we don't acknowledge and address that inequity, then equality cannot be achieved and equity can't be achieved. So we must consider the concept of addressing the needs that are already in existence. Next slide. So this concept that runs, pretty, prevalent, that is pretty prevalent in the field of emergency management, is the concept that we need to do the most for the most. And it's really based on a philosophical concept that was created by John Stewart and Jeremy Bentham. And those are two English philosophers that came up with utilitarianism, which is basically to say that do the greatest good for the greatest number. Well, that's a flawed concept, because that leaves everyone out who is not a part of the dominant group. And so anyone that's not a part of the dominant group is not going to have their needs truly met by doing the most for the most. Once again, that's the equality-based mindset. We have to change our mindset to consider equity as the core foundation for everything that we do. Is it equitable? Our decision-making, our policy-making, our plan development, the practices that we implement, everything must be equity focused. Okay, so the enemy of equity is unacknowledged inequity. In emergency management, one of the recommendations that we've provided, not only to FEMA, but also to Congress, is that we begin to incorporate social determinants of health. What is the existing landscape of the community? What is the existing landscape of our procurement procedures? What is it that we can look at to say and to find out what the existing landscape is, so that it will allow us to create equitable systems? We cannot embed equity or improve equity without addressing inequity. For example, during COVID-19, many cities faced a challenge, certainly in the beginning, where they were told to ask the question in clinics concerning communities, low-income communities, ask the question of whether or not that person had traveled. Have you been out of the country recently? Have you gone out of the country? Have you traveled? Have you been around anyone that has been exposed, tested and exposed? And the answer kept coming up, no, I haven't been around anyone. I haven't traveled. And the numbers within the low-income communities were going up, up, up. And so finally, someone said, the people that are living in these communities are not traveling out of country. The questions that you're asking are inequitable. It requires that they say no, which causes you to deny them a test, which then forces them to go home and spread the disease to their family members. In addition, as another example, many of the testing sites that were set up originally were 5 and 6 miles outside of town or away from city centers, away from bus stops. And so finally, public health planners said, we need to make sure that we're addressing the lack of transportation, because that is a social determinant of health. So these are existing inequities that must be addressed. When we're looking for contractors post-disaster, are you intentionally being equitable If you are aware that there's a multitude of small women and minority-owned businesses that may or may not be bonded, or may not have received the training or have the relationship with the state or the county, are you going out of your way to ensure that they're included in the process, and that if they have been excluded from that relationship that would give them leverage to get the contract, are you creating opportunities for them to build a relationship? That's equity. Next slide. So one of the elements is structural racism. We could have also used bias. We could have also used gender bias. And one of the other biases, there are about 155 identified biases that people have. But this one applies to structural racism. So within the field of emergency management, our leadership is made up of 82% whites. The emergency management directors are 71% male. And it really could say 71% males over the age of 45. So what happens when decisions are made and there's a lack of diversity in the room? Well, the decisions that are made, the policies that are created, and the concepts and thoughts that are discussed are going to benefit the group of people that are in the room making those decisions. Oftentimes, decisions are created, policies are made that in theory could benefit, should benefit a different group, but they don't. When there's a lack of diversity, there's a lack of perspective. So whatever you're creating, whatever you're developing will not be as effective as if diversity had existed in the room. And that goes for emergency management. And it also covers every area within our systems in the United States. So next slide. What are the impacts of bias in emergency management? Well, these are the same impacts that we would see from a multitude of other organizations, companies as well. The impacts are that you would see talented people not being hired and or not allowed opportunity for development and career progression. You would also see where diverse voices are not heard in meetings. Someone gave an excellent example when they mentioned that within emergency management, because there are so many males in the room, so many men, oftentimes the women will become much more aggressive in their communication style, or they will become much more silent, where they will not contribute unless they're specifically asked their opinion. And it's because the room has become comfortable and, everyone is communicating in a very forceful, more male accepted communication style. And that's unfortunate. And that also causes women to leave organizations. And we talk about lack of diversity in leadership and power, and that's the impacts. And that just has a ripple effect in so many areas. And many of these others where we see it also impedes community resilience when we don't have enough diversity, equity, and inclusion. Where there is bias in the workplace, you must continue to add equity as much as possible, because the equity will address the bias directly. And we can talk more about that when we go into operationalizing equity. But we cannot change what we do not see or acknowledge. So we must acknowledge existing inequities and those things that make it more difficult for others to receive promotion, receive consideration, and also be as prepared and resilient as everyone else. Next slide. Operationalizing equity. Operationalizing equity requires intention. It requires the use of data and metrics. It requires additional training. It requires creating measurable impact by building resilience in the most vulnerable areas, the most vulnerable communities, those that have been marginalized, those that have been disenfranchised. For example, when we think about redlining, and of course, redlining is where the housing opportunities for people of color and for those who are considered, who were considered low income, but primarily it was along the lines of race. They were offered, indeed, almost required to populate neighborhoods that were less than desirable, that were sometimes located near hazard areas. For example, a chemical plant that could become destabilized during a disaster. So redlining and those other very inequitable policies have created a situation where certain groups are much more vulnerable to disasters. That has to be addressed. That must be addressed. When we look at the structural racism within the United States and we look at the impacts to the economy, and we understand that our lowest income groups are groups of color, whether or not it's the indigenous populations, our Latinx community, our African American community, we have to understand that structural racism has created inequities in multiple areas. So that must be addressed in your planning, in your policies, and in the procedures that are being created. Next slide. Finally, we get to how to operationalize equity. How are we going to do that? Well, the first thing is to commit to equity, to embed it in everything. There's a way to verbally commit to equity, but there's an even better way to do it in your policies and practices, to look at your mission statements, to look at your policies for operations, embed equity in every area, do an equity review. It's called an equity audit. Those are very valuable. The next is to focus on the people. Identify the most vulnerable groups in your community. In some ways, it might be as simple as creating a language map. It might be as simple as doing a vulnerability assessment within the community, so you know where the areas of vulnerability are. This is helpful for disaster planning because it allows emergency managers the opportunity to pre-stage and pre-order commodities so that when a disaster happens or is forecast to occur, you can actually begin movement of materials to those most vulnerable areas in a shorter time frame, which will therefore limit the recovery time. So it's very important to focus on the people. And if your emergency management organization, whether it's at the city, the county, the state, if it's not representative of the communities that it serves, a change needs to occur. We must have representation. That representation creates the equity that we need to achieve so that we can mitigate, reduce the negative impacts of disaster on vulnerable populations. Right now, historically, disasters are most traumatic and most negatively impacting communities that are already vulnerable and have been marginalized. We see that with COVID-19. We see that with every hurricane. The only way to stop it is to embed equity. Next, ensure equity in transactions. Equitably distribute resources. Hire diversity. Look for opportunities to be inclusive in all forms. Next, guarantee equity in public messaging. Reasonably offer translation for very diverse communities. We talked about a language map. That's one opportunity to get ahead of that situation. But oftentimes, I just spoke to an institute in Alaska, and their chief complaint was that when emergency messages are released, oftentimes they don't even get the message in a language they can understand. Can you imagine going through a disaster, everyone else receiving emergency messaging, everyone else knowing what's happening, what to do, and your group not being a part of the emergency messaging, having to learn what's happening third, fourth hand, and too late to do anything about it. And last, we see provide transparency of decisions and data. And when we're looking at transparency, we want to make sure that we're also focusing on getting feedback from our customers. Oftentimes we think we've done a great job. I've been deployed and others in our field have been deployed to disasters, and we think we're doing a great job. And if we don't speak to the community, we won't know that you did a terrible job or that you forgot to do this very important thing. I know that I've been deployed. I was deployed once to an area in North Carolina, and it sticks out in my memory because I was assigned to community outreach for that disaster. I was coming from Georgia. I worked for the state of Georgia. I was deployed to North Carolina to help with a hurricane. And when I showed up, they said, "Who sent the colored girl?" That was the first thing. And the second thing was that our team didn't want to go into areas that were predominantly African American. And so the consensus was to send the colored girl. So when we talk about a lack of diversity, I shouldn't have received that response. But I received that response because there was a lack of diversity on the deployment team. And secondly, the fact that none of the people I was deployed with wanted to interact with people of color. However, it gave me perspective for what I'm doing right now, which is educating and providing the realities of discrimination. And I've had the same response to showing up as the only woman as well. So the biases that people live with every day are very, very apparent in times of disaster. In fact, I think they're even more apparent. It's like right underneath the surface. I've heard some crazy things. So it's important to have diversity and representation and to really operationalize equity in everyday work and in everything that we're doing. It's a mindset shift. Next slide. So now we'd like to go into our breakout groups for about 10 minutes. And I think Kayla's going to break us out and we will discuss these questions. These are the questions that we will be discussing. Next slide. Has your department committed to funding and prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion? How could you operationalize equity within your department? And what is your process for hiring diverse candidates, for selecting diverse contractors? So mull over those questions and you'll have about 10 minutes to discuss.
To share, yeah.
Me too, Dustin. It would be good. Thanks.
Thanks everybody for the breakouts. I know, apologies to Bob. We had him mid-sentence and we had to run out of the breakout room. So great conversation. Ace, I'm sure you all did as well. Chauncia, what did y'all talk about in your breakout room?
Well, Dustin was right in the middle of his explanation, but everyone got a chance to speak. Leslie actually spoke about the commitment to diversity, being very intentional about where you put your funding and what kind of suppliers you're selecting. Put your money where your mouth is.
Awesome. Well, if Chris doesn't mind, I'm going to put him on the spot here for just a second. I think he brought up a really interesting point in our breakout room. So often we hear about the external perception of who's doing what around DEI. And in Washington, maybe it's a little bit different from what we're accustomed to. Chris, do you mind sharing what's happening up in your state?
Sure. The way we discussed it at our breakout was that the state of Washington really has two things that or split in what they're doing. We have an external program and then we have an internal program. And our external program is way more mature than our internal program. So if you look at all the things we're doing with DEI and contracting and public works, inclusion plans, outreach, a disparity study that we've done, the recommendations and the implementation of those recommendations for contracting, those things are going swimmingly well. Our transportation agencies do extremely well in that area. But if you look internally at what our agencies are doing, recruiting, putting together DEI initiatives, making sure that we have equitable workforce, how we interview our people, the tools that we have available, perhaps the money that we need to fund things, we're not as mature. As a matter of fact, we're just starting out on that effort. And that effort still needs to be organized. And since we have a federated system of agencies within the state of Washington, some of those efforts are divided among the agencies. So we're not completely there. A lot of effort going on, but we're not mature yet.
Thanks, Chris. I just find that very interesting, the internal versus external. That's a great conversation for us to continue with. Ace, how about what you all talked about in your breakout room?
Yeah, I mean, coming off of Chris's last point there, not necessarily being mature, part of what I shared from my work as a diversity and inclusion trainer is, you know, a lot of the starts are good and the work is necessary, but not sufficient as we frame it. And so we were talking about the levels of inclusion, starting from invisibility before we know what we don't know, all the way up to a culture of inclusion. And we heard from Missouri and Washington State and California on a couple fronts. Some of the programs happening in Missouri sound really, really compelling. And it was cool to have been out there last week with the team. Of course, Chris just spoke to Washington State. And Cindy shared some of the initiatives happening there. I believe the first state agency with an Office of Inclusion, and don't quote me on that office title, but seemed like a big initiative just to put the office in place to start having that conversation. Office of Equity. Thank you, Cindy. And then, you know, on California's front, continuing to make sure that there's equitable representation is an important piece. And, you know, as we were discussing, like, part of the frustration is we should have been having this conversation for a long time. And it feels like we're just now getting to it or perhaps back to it. And so, you know, a little bit of frustration there, but it sounds like everybody is doing the long work, as we say in the DEI world, and that's important.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Ace, so much. So Chauncia, let me turn it back over to you for some final thoughts.
Well, you know, this was a great discussion. I was telling him yesterday, I said, you know, we should just have everyone, you know, discuss what their initiatives are and what is the work that you're doing within your organizations that you consider meaningful around this subject of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And our organization, of course, specifically focuses on disasters and emergency management and the concept of disaster equity, and making sure that our most vulnerable groups don't continue to endure the brunt of disasters, because it makes everyone's heart just ache. But when we could do something about it, we just need to go ahead and put those plans in place and reframe the way that we're thinking about people, but also about how to operationalize equity. So I'm just thankful for the time. And I love all of the different initiatives that are going on and all of the work that's being done to embed equity. This has been one of the stellar groups that we've spoken to about this concept that is already doing so much work. So as Ace said, the long work, keep your eyes on the prize, and the prize is equity for all. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Chauncia. We have so appreciated you being with us today. I know we'll definitely stay in touch and really include you on many of these conversations going forward. They're doing great work in the States with some great key decision makers right here. So we're thrilled that you could have been here with our group today. And that kind of tees up our next conversation. We are so excited at NASCA that we are able to announce one of our newest professional forums around DEI and really taking a very deep dive, a very dedicated and deliberate conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion, not only with our state chief administrators, but with diversity officers, EEO officers as well. And then we have Rebecca Russell on the phone with us from Illinois, who is leading our charge, and I'm being so incredibly wonderful to work with me on agenda setting and creating some opportunities to expand and really deep dive into this conversation. So Rebecca, you want to give them a sneak peek about our December event?
Sure. Thanks so much, Pam. And I'm really excited to kick this off. So you'll be getting more information about our first DEI forum. It is going to be happening December 14th, which is a Monday. And that will be in the afternoon hour from 2 to 3 Eastern, I believe 2 to 3 Eastern, yes. And so we're really excited to really talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, to really, again, do that deep dive and have more conversations about that. But we also realize that every state is in a different space. So this is going to be a great opportunity for us to have open dialogue, share best practices, really get some insight from multiple folks about where they are in their diversity journey. Some people have started, some people are kind of in the middle of it and need some direction. Some people haven't started at all. Some states haven't started at all. So I think that's the beauty and that's the beauty in these forums, right? And so it's important that we continue to have these dialogues. And I think that we should not let the momentum leave us that was already really kind of ignited in 2020 with the recent civil unrest, the global pandemic. I think this is definitely an opportunity for us to really take this momentum, continue to turn it into a positive, and to continue to make our states better. So be on the lookout for that. Extremely excited to chair this forum. And we look forward to continuing this dialogue next month.
Awesome. Thank you, Rebecca. We are so excited again to have you on board and look forward to that conversation. So be on the